Thank you. In 1984, my father was killed in a terrorist attack in England in the UK. The IRA said they were responsible, and by the end of the day, I'd not just lost my father, who I adored, but I lost the me that lived in peace, the me that felt that life was there for fun and joy, because I'm now part of a war. I feel part of a violent conflict. I have an enemy, but I never wanted an enemy. So 2 days later, I made a choice. Do I blame? Do I keep an enemy? Do I go for revenge? Or do I find a way to bring something compassionate out of it? Can I contribute to peace? Can I bring something positive? And I decided to choose the way of forgiveness and peace. I didn't have a map. I didn't know people who'd been on this journey. But I trusted that life was going to bring me the experiences I needed. Within a few weeks, I ended up sharing a taxi in London with a random stranger. And I could tell from his accent he came from Northern Ireland. So I said to him, this is an odd question. My father's just been killed by the IRA. And I'm trying to understand, why would someone join the IRA? Do you know? And he said to me, that's not strange. My brother, he was in the IRA, and he was killed by a British soldier last year. We should have been enemies. This is the height of the conflict, and we represented each other's other. My father was a politician from the UK, and he would have seen me as his enemy. But this young man in the taxi and we talked about a world where nobody got killed, where nobody killed, and a world where peace was possible. And I left that taxi thinking, I can build a bridge across the divide. And even though no one knows, I know. And I felt that was the first step I'd made. The next few years I travelled to Northern Ireland, and I actually went public in 1986 where I said, I forgive the man who killed my father. I got death threats. I got hate mail. I was told I betrayed my father. And so I went a bit quiet and stopped. I carried on going to Northern Ireland, but it was something that was challenging me emotionally until we had the peace process. The peace process meant that finally people came together from America, from Europe, from the UK, from Ireland, to sit together and create an agreement. And I welcomed that because less people were going to be killed. I felt every time anyone was hurt, injured, killed, because my heart knew the pain of that suffering. So I welcomed the peace process. And one day I'm turning on the TV, the news, and there is the only person ever put in prison for planting the bomb, Patrick Magee. And he's coming out of prison. Now, I didn't know he was coming out of prison. It was a shock. And I felt angry. How is it that he can come out free, early? My dad can't come back. This is the year 99. But then I thought, this is for peace. This means less people are going to be killed, so I welcomed it. And he was released early as part of the peace process. So then the idea came to me, I'd like to meet him. And I travelled to Northern Ireland after the peace process and went to a lot of amazing workshops, and I met people who knew him, and I said, could you arrange this meeting? And 3 times I heard back, sorry, Joe, doesn't want to meet you. I felt disappointed, but also, if it's right, it's going to happen. And I carried on. I carried on meeting other people who were my other, who were my enemy, and built bridges with them. There were many bridges to build. And one day I'm speaking at a conference in Dublin, and I've written a poem which is all about meeting Patrick, called Bridges Can Be Built. And someone came up to me and said, I can arrange that meeting. And I said, please do. 3 months later, I got a phone call from a dear friend of mine, Anne Gallagher in Dublin, and she said, Patrick Magee has agreed to be in my house tonight. Can you be there? And my first thought was, I'm not in the mood. I'm not feeling visionary today. I'm about to go to Ireland and I'm looking after my little children. I can't do this. This is October 2000. But of course I said yes, Because how would it feel easy to meet the man who's killed my father? And I travel on my own on a ferry between Wales and Dublin, and I now do restorative processes. This breaks every rule because I'm on my own. There's no one there to support me. There's no preparation. I'm in my friend's house, and it's very chaotic. There's people coming and going, phones going. At one point, Anne says, "Jo, would you finish cooking supper?" And I'm like, I can't finish cooking supper. I'm about to meet the man who killed my father. My mind was full of it. But then I thought, he knows very little about me. Maybe he's more scared than I am. I don't know how I'm going to feel when I see him. Am I going to be angry? Will I want to blame him? But how will he feel? And then there's that moment when he walks into the kitchen, and I got up and I shook his hand and thanked him for coming. And he said, "Oh no, thank you for inviting me. You were very polite." And I said, "I do appreciate you changing your mind and agreeing to meet me." And he said, "A few times I've been asked to meet you, and I've always said yes." And we're still finding out why people didn't want us to meet. And I think it was very early on in the peace process. And it was challenging. They were either protecting him or protecting me. But we did it. We had our meeting. The first hour and a half was in a small room. I was just looking at him, and I remember thinking, "You don't look like my idea of a terrorist." Another voice was, "Go now, Jo, go now. This man killed your father, just go." But I stayed because I was curious. Who was he beneath the labels he'd been given? And at that time, he was the most demonised terrorist we had in the UK because he nearly killed the whole government. Obviously, it's changed since then. But I was curious and I listened. And he started off by giving me his political version of why he joined the IRA. For him, it was about oppression. It was about their community being oppressed. It was about human rights. But I was curious. I still wanted to know more. And I listened to him in a way I don't think I'd ever listened to anyone. And after an hour and a half, I remember looking into his eyes and seeing some care he had, some humanity. And he's no longer this terrible label I've been given. He's no longer my enemy. He's now a human being with a story. I'm never going to agree with what he did, but I could see him as a human being, and that restored some of my humanity that was robbed when the bomb went off. I now have it back. I didn't meet him to change him. I didn't meet him for an apology. I met him to see him as a human being. So I thought, I'm going to go now, because it's quite hard hearing him still justify killing my father. And then he stopped talking. And he looked at me and he said, "Jo, I'd never met anyone like you before, with so much dignity and so open. I don't know who I am anymore. What can I do for you?" And I knew that he'd taken off his political hat and he'd become open and vulnerable. And what had been my need, my journey, now became his need as he started his own journey of realising that he had lost some humanity through using violence. He arrived at that meeting, fine, no problems. I was the one. And now he realised there's a cost to himself, and he didn't know that before. I began to ask about my father. What kind of man was he? Because when he planted that bomb, he saw no one in the building. No one at all. And now he's realising, my father had a soul. My father had children. People loved him, and he killed him. And he begins to take the responsibility and accountability and wanted to know the impact on me. It was a very different conversation. And after another hour and a half, I felt like I couldn't listen anymore, because as I'm listening to him, I'm listening to the voices in my head that are finding it difficult. So I ended it and I said to him, "Thank you for coming." And he said, "Jo, I'm really sorry I killed your father." Now, I didn't go for the apology, but what I got from that was that he now sees my dad as a human being. Something's been restored. And I said to him, I'm so glad it's you. And then I walked out. And next time I met him, he said, "What did you mean?" "I'm so glad it's you." And I said, "Your preparedness to open up, the courage to feel the impact, to listen to me, to see my dad as a human being. I didn't know that would happen." And 22 years later, I still feel the same. I am so glad it's him. Of course, I wish I hadn't lost my father in a terrorist attack. But the fact that Patrick and Magee were still in touch, we've become friends. It has been challenging at times. but we travelled in different parts of the world. We've actually been here in Israel together quite a long time ago now. And I'm grateful to him, because what I've learnt from him, I don't think I could learn any other way. He would later say that he was disarmed by my empathy. And if I'd gone in there raging and ranting, going, I'm right, you're wrong, you're bad, you're evil, he would have stayed in a very safe place of self-righteousness. He wouldn't have changed. But I went there open and vulnerable, not exerting my power over him, but being with him, empathizing with him, understanding him, and that disarmed him. So the me 22 years ago had very low self-esteem, didn't have much sense of my worth, but I managed to disarm him through listening, through opening my heart and acknowledging the pain that he'd been through. I've learned over the last 22 years, even forgiveness for me can be a difficult word. Because sometimes I feel when people forgive, it's about, I'm so amazing and gracious, I'm going to forgive you, but still keep you wrong. That to me is not what forgiveness is about. I remember going to amazing mountains in Ireland and walking with him. We were being part of a documentary and we had some time off from the camera. And he shared so much about his pain, what he experienced, what led him from age 14 being passionate about non-violence until 18 choosing violence. And I was overcome with feelings of just what he'd been through, his own trauma. And I wondered, if I'd lived his life, if I'd been through everything he'd been through, if I inherited the trauma he'd inherited, would I have made the same choices? I don't know. And in that moment, there is nothing to forgive. There is unbounded empathy. And that releases me from any seeing him as doing anything wrong for being wrong, is that understanding and empathy. Now, I don't always live that empathy with him. We have had arguments over the years. I've moved myself into being very self-righteous. We've argued about Gandhi, which was quite an interesting argument. But I've learned I can challenge him still, but challenging him without blaming him, without shaming him, without making him wrong, so he can choose to change at any moment. And he can choose to work with me or not. There's always choice in this. I do believe that hatred is also a choice, because hatred is not just an emotion. Hatred is emotion plus a thought. So the emotion could be pain, suffering, sorrow, distress, trauma. But the thought is, and you're responsible. That causes the hatred. So I'm changing the story in my head. If I'd made Patrick responsible for all my pain and suffering, and I've had secondary trauma to do with choices I've made, I've had some dark times, as I'm sure we all have. And in those low times, I could go, well, it's all to do with that bomb. It could have completely influenced my life and be the reason why things have gone wrong. I would have been hurt twice. Once from the original attack of losing my dad, and two, having a voice in my head of someone who hurts me all the time. That would be giving my power to him. I took my power back 2 days after the bomb went off. I had no choice over what happened to me that day, but I'm choosing how I respond. I'm going to take responsibility. I'm going to find ways to feel better. And that carries on. That will never end. So I've taken my power back. And now when I think about Patrick in my head, he has become a friend, an ally, someone who's been teaching me. So I'm changing the story. And people say to me, Jo, but what would happen if you could never meet him? It doesn't matter. I still would have changed the story in my head. I want people who I think about in my head are people who love me and who I love. So it's always taking my power back. When I blame, and I still have that need to blame, it has not gone away. When things happen, there's that voice, who's responsible, who can I blame? And occasionally, I even do things to hurt people still. I remember wanting to write a text to one of my daughter's boyfriends because she'd hurt him. He'd hurt her. And there's a voice in my head saying, don't write it, you're going to regret it. I don't care. And the need for revenge was huge. I know the kind of pain that wants to hurt, even to kill. And I remember working with a group who have all been through such trauma, and they were like, we can't forgive. We want revenge. I said, revenge sometimes feels like stopping gravity. It's that difficult. So I'm never going to judge anyone for revenge. If someone's coming at me with anger and revenge, I'm going to say, and they do, tell me your story. What's happened to you? And as soon as someone starts telling their story, it's no longer them wanting revenge. So I'm giving up blame all the time. I'm taking responsibility. I'm taking my power back. And what would the world look like if we had unbounded empathy for everyone? If we didn't demonize people, if we didn't make people wrong and us right, if we didn't try to shame people, if we understood there's a story, and yes, we do need to challenge behavior, but without demonizing people. I do a lot of restorative processes now. I've just finished quite a high-profile gang case in the UK. And this young man's in prison for a long time. Luckily not life, because we don't have life in the UK in the same way as the States, but he's there for a long time. And it was an honour to meet this young man, and he killed someone at 17. And for me, it's not about forgiveness. He's found his voice. He's got his confidence because he's done what he's needed to do. He's looked at the mother of the young man he's killed and said, I see you. It says 4 minutes, just realised. And is it about forgiveness? Some people love the word forgiveness and bring meaning, some people don't. And I think we choose our own way, our own path. And some people might call it forgiveness, others might call it compassion, others might call it love, others might call it giving revenge. Because even though there can be guides, I do believe we have our own path. We have our own way of transforming our trauma. And the amount of pain I felt has now been transformed in the amount of love and compassion that I have for the world. And yes, there have been difficult times. That's where people have arrived in my life to give me that support and go, Jo, keep on going. And I am not going to stop. And I want to end with just this idea that when we give up our right to make people wrong, when we give up our right for revenge, when we give up trying to change the past, the future can be amazing. The future can be full of unbounded empathy, different ways of challenging, restorative ways. Ways where people choose to change rather than the force, the finger wagging, the punishment. Because when we change because we want to, it's much more powerful and it's more loving. And if Patrick was here right now, I would say to him, thank you. Thank you for being brave enough to show up 22 years ago when you did not know who you were going to meet. Thank you for opening your heart to realising my dad had a soul. Thank you for listening to me and teaching me about violence, because I am a more loving person through dialoguing with you for the last 22 years. And of course, thanks and love to my dad always, who before he died gave me enough to show me the way that I could go. Thank you. Amen.